I spent the morning with my Savior, which brought me through my afternoon. And by the time I reached the evening, my soul was singing hallelujah. Like a ship tossed and driven, I've been up and down. Like a prisoner in prison, yes, the devil had me bound. But I know my future's brighter than the past I left behind. Had a little talk with Jesus, and the victory is mine. I spent the morning with my Savior, which brought me through my afternoon. And by the time I reached the evening, my soul was singing hallelujah.
Good morning, and welcome to Good Morning with me, Caffie. Today I have a special guest. She is a friend, she is a mentor, she is my former professor. Yes, a former professor friend. I took a spirituality and bereavement class with her at a seminary in California. I can't even remember the name right now, Terri, but I took it with Dr. Terri, and we became friends after. And today I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Terri Daniel. I want to read her bio to you all. Dr. Terri Daniel is an interfaith hospice chaplain, end-of-life educator, and grief counselor certified in death, dying, bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling, and in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She conducts workshops throughout the U.S. and teaches at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Dr. Terri is also the founder of the Afterlife Conference, which she's going to share with you about. It's now in its 11th year, and the Ask Dr. Death podcast. She is also the author of not one book, but 4 books, everybody, on death, grief, and the afterlife. Over the years, Dr. Terri has helped hundreds of people learn to live, die, and grieve more consciously. Her work is acclaimed by hospice professionals, spiritual seekers, therapists, theologians, and academics worldwide. She has a BA in religious studies from Marylhurst University, an MA in pastoral care from Fordham University, and a Doctor of Ministry in Pastoral Care and Counseling from San Francisco Theological Seminary. So I welcome you, Terri. Dr. Terri Daniels, welcome to the broadcast. I thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation about religious trauma.
Thank you, Caffie. Thank you so much. It's so much fun to do this with you, and you look gorgeous.
And you
as
do
always.
too. You do too. I'm so excited to bring you to my listening audience, which is a whole different kind of platform. And today, as we explore religious beliefs that inhibits healthy responses to loss and bereavement, why don't you first start with telling us a little bit about the book that you wrote, but talk about your conference first, Dr. Terri, because it's coming up, and I want to make sure we get that in. And then after you talk about your conference, then define religious trauma and talk to us about that.
Okay, thank you. So the Afterlife Conference, which you can find at afterlifeconference.com, has been going on for a long time. This will be the 11th year. And it started out because we wanted to create a conference where people could come and talk about their mystical spiritual experiences around death and grief. And I mean things like out-of-body experiences, deathbed visions and dreams, near-death experiences, that kind of thing. And there, at the time, were no other conferences that actually focused on this topic. So that's how it started. over the years, we've had all the leaders in this field. If you may be familiar with Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote the book Life After Life in the 70s, Dr. Melvin Morse, who did research on the near-death experiences of children. We've had psychic mediums. We've had religious scholars like Bishop John Shelby Spong and Andrew Harvey. This year's conference, our keynote speaker is Robert Thurman, who is the leading authority on Buddhism in the West. He's best buddies with the Dalai Lama. So, and then we have, of course, grief counselors and psychologists and shamans who teach us how to journey out of the body and how to die consciously. So it's got such a mix of spiritual stuff and science stuff and social stuff, and it's afterlifeconference.com, and it would be great to see some of you guys there.
Give us the dates, Dr. Terri.
June 24th through 27th, 2021.
And it's all online this year.
It's 100% online this year, as it was last year because of COVID. Okay. But in 2022, we will be live in person in Portland, Oregon. So go to afterlifeconference.com, sign up for the email list, and you'll get notifications of all that.
Great, great. So now let's get into religious trauma, the image of God, the Imago Dei, right?
Yes.
Where people are dealing with God, the image, their grief, their loss, their trauma. Define what all of this is. Talk to us, Terri. Talk to us.
Okay, so the term religious trauma was coined by a therapist by the name of Marlene Winnell, I believe, and it's really kind of new in the vernacular. And what we're finding is, well, first of all, we know that religiosity is changing in America, and now something like the latest Pew research said something like less than 50% of people are affiliated with a religious tradition or a church. And that interest is going down because now that we have access to other cultures and other belief systems because of the internet. You can go online and you can find out what the shamans in Peru do for grief and death, or you can see what do they do in China to honor the ancestors, or what are the African rituals for grieving. And we're starting to see all this other stuff, and our very narrow, very mainstream Judeo-Christian approach to death is looking kind of limited in comparison to all this other stuff. And so religious trauma kind of emerged out of this, where we're finding a lot of people who are dealing with trauma and loss and grief, and the only spiritual tools they have are the tools they were given when they were 5 years old in Sunday school. And they're not adequate. So when you're 3, 4, 5 years old, you are given your religious education, and you're taught, about Genesis, creation, and Noah's Ark, and sin and salvation, and heaven and hell, and all this stuff. And when you're a little kid, you just kind of sit with that and let it sit there, and you never think about it again. Most people, not all people, until something bad happens. So fast forward, and now you're 50. And you've been diagnosed with a terrible illness, or your child has died, or something other traumatic thing, and you reach for some sort of help for coping, and all you have spiritually is a theology that is not helpful. That's not religious trauma. Religious trauma goes quite a bit further than that, and religious trauma has to do with if you were raised in a very, very strict religious environment with extreme behavior codes and rules, where you were not allowed to associate with outside people. If you were taught that anybody outside your group is going to hell unless they're converted, women are oppressed. There's so many. These are basically characteristics of cults. And many, many people were raised in strict evangelical communities, Pentecostal communities, Orthodox Jewish communities, many, where literally they were traumatized as children and basically taught to think of themselves as flawed and broken and unworthy.
So let's fast forward. Now I'm experiencing grief, loss. I've lost a loved one that was close to me. where religious trauma is concerned, am I now blaming God where this is concerned? Am I saying he's judging me? He's punishing me for this particular loss? Did I have something to do with it? Talk to me about religious trauma where that's concerned.
Yeah. That's very common. There are, as you know, Caffie, so many religious beliefs, the sins of the father and all that stuff. And,
Right.
we're all punished because of original sin. It depends on which doctrines you attach to. But so I work as a hospice chaplain and a teacher, and I've been doing hospice chaplaincy for almost 10 years now. And this is what I hear from grieving people. We prayed and we prayed and we prayed. We had the whole church and the phone calls and the prayer chain that he wouldn't die, and he died anyway. What did we do wrong? How did we displease God? Why didn't God answer our prayers? And they will ask me these questions. And I can't give you an answer to that question. So what I can do as a chaplain is I turn it back on you, and I say, well, what does your faith tell you about prayer? How does prayer work? And what you might tell me is, well, if you're devoted enough and you pray hard enough, God will answer. But we find out every day in the hospital and in the hospice that it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
You can pray and be the most devoted person in the world, i.e. Book of Job, just saying.
Yes.
and bad stuff's going to happen. So,
you.
we really work to try to help. Well, when I say we, I don't mean chaplains. I mean in the classes that I teach and the religious trauma community, to help people shift their idea of the image of God. Okay. That God is not a vending machine. You put in a quarter and you get a treat.
So with shifting the image of God, because I have also been in the hospital as a chaplain, and I can remember a family, the mother had hit her head in a building, a senior citizen building. She was walking and she fell, and the floors of cement, and she literally hit her head and was instantly brain dead. And they kept her alive, and the family, they kept calling. And I was on the phone with a few of the family members, and they were believing God, that God was going to raise her up. And they were like, we're believing God, and we want you to pray, and we want you to pray like this. And here I am, ordained clergy. I'm looking at what's before me, and I get miracles. I get all of that. But my spirit, if you will, I was not led to pray that kind of prayer. But I turned it around to the person that was on the phone, and I said to him, why don't you pray? Because you can't see what I'm seeing. I'm in the room. But why don't you pray, exercise your faith, and I will be in prayer with you as we put you on speakerphone to pray for your loved one. Well, she ended up dying, and I met some of those same family members who kind of like shunned me because I guess they didn't believe that I was in standing in faith with them. So what does religion what happens, Terri, when religion does more harm than good with a person's healing?
Yeah, good, excellent question. And hold that thought for a minute, because I want to say that the story you just told is so important. And then when people are in grief, of course, they want to find something to blame. So of course they blamed you. Also, people think that chaplains are, have some special deal with God, that God will listen to us more than to them. I mean, it's all just weird thinking, it's immature, childlike. That's 5-year-old Sunday school thinking. So I want to add another story to yours that I heard from a pediatrician friend of mine who was present with this family, who had a 2-year-old kid dying of brain cancer. And it was, the child was really very close to death. There was no hope for him to survive. And the doctor said, let's have an end of life conversation. We need to really talk about, do you want to keep him on life support? Do you want a feeding tube? Do you want a ventilator? And the family said, oh, no, we cannot have that conversation, doctor. We can't talk to you about that, because even if we talk about it, God will know that we're not faithful enough. So even up until that point, they were praying, thinking that God was going to swoop in and transform this child and take the brain cancer away. And they were so wrapped up in this thinking of being faithful enough that they were prohibited from even talking about the possibility of death. So that's one way that religion can do more harm than healing, is it can stop you from having your feet firmly placed in reality. That's
Mm-hmm.
one example. There's so many examples. If you're dealing with, as a grief counselor, I have people who have horrible suicides in their lives. People who've come home from work and opened the garage to find their teenage kid hanging from the rafters. I mean, I hear stories like this every day, and they feel like they're being punished. They feel like their child who died of suicide is going to hell because they believe that all suicides go to hell, which, by the way, the Catholic Church doesn't even say that anymore.
Right. And neither does the Christian church. As a matter of fact, we had in my church some years ago a deacon who jumped off of the George Washington Bridge. And some of the church was dealing with, where did he end up? And our pastor had to confront the church with the Bible, with the truth of the word as we know it from my faith perspective. And he had to let them know it's not in there. That doesn't mean we want people committing suicide, but he had to just let them know it's not stated in there. And that's something that we went through from a child. If you commit suicide, you're going to end up in hell, so don't do it. And that was driven in our self-conscious and our conscious right until we got up into age. And so he literally had to confront that. And that was over like 10, 15 years ago.
And did the people accept that? Did that help?
I believe some did, who understood the scriptures, and then some just had their own belief, Terri, over the years. And this is what it is. This is what my mama taught me. My daddy taught me this in the Carolinas, and this is what I'm going with.
Yeah. There's so many like that. I'll give you another example. A woman whose 9-year-old son died of leukemia, and she believed that the reason that happened was because God was punishing her because 20 years earlier she had had an abortion. So God was punishing her by taking this child in exchange for the one that she sent back.
So that's the religious trauma that people are putting themselves through, that I'm suffering, I'm going through this experience because I did something wrong and God is now punishing me. This is my reward, whether it's a good reward or a bad reward. Is that part of this whole conversation around religious trauma?
Well, religious trauma is more about what you grew up in as a child. So I work with a lot of people. In fact, there's a conference coming up in May, I think it's May 12th, called the Conference on Religious Trauma. And if you want to put that in your show notes or something that, people might want to go to that. I'll give you an example. Do you remember the Westboro Baptist Church? The crazy guy, Fred Phelps, and they would have the God hates fags posters and picket military funerals, those guys. Well, that church only has about 75 members, and they're all family and in-laws. It's not a big church, but one of the sons of that guy escaped that cult and is now an activist in the religious trauma movement. So in his life, he was a child who was told that everybody outside his little family group was going to hell, and that God hates gay people, God hates people of color, God hates Jews, God hates everybody except us. And a lot of people were raised to various extremes in thinking like that. Another man that I know, when he was a kid with his church, little kid, like 8, 9 years old, they would take him to the beach in Florida, and the kids would go walking around to the people on the beach sunbathing in their bathing suits and preach to them that, they were sinful being out there at the beach with their skin exposed and being, tempting sex and all that stuff. I mean, and he used to be sent on street corners to preach, when he was a kid. So that's religious trauma.
Okay.
And
And we have a lot of people who grew up in strong religious traditions where they couldn't go to the movies. It's
mhm,
something, it's sinful to go to the movies. It's sinful to wear lipstick or jewelry or makeup or long or short skirts, or your clothing had to be just right. So where grief, Terri, is concerned, and someone is believing that I'm being punished by God, what do you say to him or to her that's holding on to this belief, this false image of God?
right. So what I would say just personally is that's utter bullshit and that God doesn't exist. That's what I'd like to say. But as a
I
chaplain,
love you.
I can't say that. So what I would say if I, in a chaplaincy setting is where did you get that idea that God works that way? Let's unpack this belief. And, if I had the time to counsel them that way, I would invite them to unpack their whole childhood, all the teachings that, well, I was always told when I was a kid that God's always watching and God will punish me if I don't clean my room, and that we're all born in sin and we're just, sheep and we're helpless without God and God's in charge of everything. So I was always told as a kid that if I pleased God and did everything right, that I would be protected because God loves me and Jesus walks with me. And I have this veil of protection over me. And that's what I was always told.
Mm.
And now I'm not protected. So what happened to that God? And my answer to that would be, well, maybe that's not what God is. Maybe you might consider a different idea of what God is. And then they'll say, well, what would that be? And I can't really tell them, I can only
Right.
tell them how I would define it. And I would define God as a non-humanoid force of creation in the universe that doesn't look like a person, doesn't behave like a person. It's just a way of describing all that is, period. It doesn't have moral codes. It doesn't have judgments. It doesn't watch us. It doesn't really even care what we do. It doesn't love us. It doesn't hate us. It doesn't reward us. It doesn't punish us. It's just cosmology. It's just the force of creation. Now, can we manipulate that force? Can we pray to it and say, please don't let me have cancer? And it will listen to us and take the cancer away? I don't think so. A lot of people do think so. I personally don't think that it works that way. So, prayer is difficult. So,
Some prayers are answered, and
how do we know that?
by some people they're healed
And
either
some
on this
people are
side or
not.
the other
So,
side.
but how do we know that the healing or not healing has anything to do with prayer? It would have happened anyway. We don't know. Right? I mean, you could take 10 people, and they've done studies on this in the hospitals where 10 people are praying for this guy and 10 people are not praying for him.
Mm-hmm.
And, the outcomes, they've done this like many groups of people, the outcomes are random.
Right.
But you can also see, studies where they say, well, the one that got the prayers, more of them recovered than not. But you can also see other studies that say the opposite.
Right.
And there's so many other factors, and like
So
the
that
ones who did, yeah,
no,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead.
So, you could say, well, the ones that didn't recover who had prayer is, someone would say, well, that's because the people weren't devoted enough. They weren't praying hard enough. That's another toxic belief.
Yeah, that is toxic. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of that we have seen throughout the pandemic, where you've had one person to die, the other one is still here. A few family members that died that were strong believers, and people are just trying to make sense out
Right.
of
Because the
how.
one who died and the one who didn't got the same amount of prayer. Say, for example, in your church, right? Everybody's praying for all of them. You have 10 COVID patients. We're all praying really hard for all 10 of them. 5 live, 5 die. Equal amount of prayer. So what causes the difference?
Mm.
That's the question, you know?
That's the question. And so this is what people are struggling with,
Yeah.
that are in that, live by their faith and trying to understand, am I being punished?
Am I being punished, or is God unhappy with me because, I violated some rule? I didn't tithe. I didn't go to church every Sunday. I didn't
Wow.
read the Bible. I did something wrong.
Terry, how do you know about Black people tithing?
Everybody tithes. White people
No,
tithe
I'm only
too.
teasing you. But that's huge in the Black church. So
Yeah.
obviously if I didn't give my tithe, then I'm cursed with a curse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this
I mean,
could
that could
be
be one of
happening.
many curses, right?
Right. One of many. And
Yeah.
this could be happening because, shoot, I forgot to give that 10%
Mhm.
last week.
Somebody might believe that.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
maybe I forgot to give that 10% ever because I don't actually go to church. But I believe
Wow.
in God and I pray,
Okay.
so maybe God's punishing me because I don't go to church. I mean,
Mm.
it's just this myriad of possible configurations of beliefs that, that people have. I had a lady once who had all 4 of her children died over a 25-year period of separate, unrelated things. Like one died as a baby, another one got hit by a car when it was 10, another one went to war at 20, another one had cancer at 25. They all died. And she said to me, I thought if I was a good person who pleased God, that this kind of thing would never happen to me. But it's happened to me now 4 times. And I know I'm doing something wrong. And if I could just figure out what I'm doing wrong to make God do this to me, then I could change it and I could be better. What am I doing wrong? How can I can't answer a question like that. She's doing nothing wrong.
Right.
She's a perfect human being, as we all are, because it doesn't work that way.
So your book, Grief and God, give us why did you write it?
Well, it's basically my doctoral dissertation
Okay.
repackaged into a book. And I wrote it because I was seeing, as a chaplain and as a grief counselor, so much of this toxic theology influencing people's grief journey. And in my research for the dissertation, I read a lot of stuff, as you have too, Caffie,
Mm-hmm.
about healthy and unhealthy religious beliefs. Pargament. You've read Pargament, right?
Yes.
What do you call it? I'm forgetting what he calls it. The religious coping scale, positive and negative religious coping. And so in his research, I even have it here, I can read it. So what he found was religious coping with loss and grief and trauma is not a bad thing. Sometimes it's very helpful, but sometimes it's not. So what he found is that there's 5 basic religious functions. One is finding meaning in a traumatic or difficult event. 2, establishing a sense of control. 3, finding comfort in a dangerous world. 4, a sense of social intimacy and community. And 5, assistance with major life transitions. Now, those are all wonderful things, but they split up into more positive and more negative aspects because of images of God. I hope this is making sense. So
it is. Mm-hmm.
So positive religious coping is you're looking for a stronger connection with the divine, with union with the divine, a sense of that you are connected rather than disconnected from God, however you define God. You seek help from God in helping you cope with the situation, whatever it may be. You make a plan of action in partnership with God about how you will go forward from this traumatic event. So those are some examples of positive religious coping. Negative religious coping says, God has abandoned me. I'm being punished for my lack of devotion. My church has abandoned me, and the devil made it happen. See the difference in those two different ways of coping? So mostly it's God has abandoned me and God is punishing me. And here's the thing. So as a chaplain, when patients ask me to pray for them or with them, and I don't pray to fix the person who's sick. I don't say, Jesus, please heal this man. That is not my tradition. That is not my theology. And what I do say is something like, we open our hearts up to God, to divine love, to recognize us and see us here and take us up in the arms of love so that we can be strong to walk through this terrible situation with grace, with faith, and accept the outcome and be strong with the outcome.
Wow. So it's a surrender.
It is a surrender.
It's a surrender.
And that is an interfaith prayer. That works if you're Buddhist or Jewish or atheist or anything.
It's a surrender.
It's a
Dr.
surrender.
Terri, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's exactly right. Perfect word for it.
And we are out of time. This has been so enlightening, and I cannot thank you enough for sharing your time with us today to talk about religious trauma, the events, the toxicity that people deal with having suffered a loss in their life. Is there any last thing you would like to say, Dr. Terri, to the audience?
You can find my book, Grief and God, When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing, on Amazon. And come to the Afterlife Conference if you can, afterlifeconference.com. And thank you, Caffie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love you so much.
I love you too. I'm so glad we know each other.
I'm so glad our paths crossed when I took the certificate program training in spirituality and bereavement at San Francisco Theological Seminary.
Right, that's where it was. Teaching. Also known as the University of Redlands.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Jason, for your technical help.
And please do not forget to subscribe, like, and share, and join us again for another episode of Good Morning with me, Caffie. God bless you.